I'm Sam Temple.
I'm Logan Ledman. In this episode of 1855, we're exploring that other town founded in 1855, Northfield.
We'll begin our discussion of Northfield similarly to how we began our exploration of Faribault, by seeking to understand the town's seminal figure. In this case, however, that man is not the town founder.
Today, we'll tell the story of a man who remains a fixture of Northfield's identity almost a century and a half after his tragic death.
Few people from Northfield's history are as well known today as Joseph Lee Heywood, but the incredible story of this man's deeply human life is seldom told.
Joseph Lee Heywood was born with the blood of American fighters in his veins. Growing up in New Hampshire, his ancestors were soldiers in the War for American Independence. He was born on August 12, 1837, and he had 6 siblings to occupy his time on the family farm.
Joseph left the farm and his siblings when he was 20 years old. He spent time living in various parts of Massachusetts and Michigan and Iowa, working as a store clerk, but his life took a turn when rebels fired on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. The debate over the sanctity of slavery had grown violent in recent years. In the aftermath of the 1860 election, southern states began seceding from the Union in preparation for their treasonous tirade. The brutal American Civil War had broken out, and Heywood, along with his country, began its long fight against the Confederate forces.
Joseph moved to Illinois to enlist. In 1862, he joined the 127th Illinois Infantry Regiment. His first duty was to keep guard at a prisoner camp housing freshly captured rebels.
The war had been raging for over a year. Hostilities between Union men and Confederates were red hot. It was in this atmosphere of hatred that Heywood was charged with guarding prisoners of war.
Conditions in prisoner of war encampments were typically squalid, disease-ravaged, and disordered, with supplies that ran low more often than not. The guards languished as much as the prisoners they were guarding. The prisoners guarded by Joseph and his compatriots set fire to the camp several times.
Joseph persisted. By the time the 127th were finally reassigned to combat duty, less than half of the men who enlisted with Heywood were still around. Most had chosen to desert rather than suffer amid the squalor and violence of the prisoners. With few of the 127th remaining, Joseph Lee Heywood was recognized as a leader among the men and promoted to corporal.
Those who stuck around with Corporal Heywood and made it to the front line did not find much better conditions. After a brief and mostly uneventful initial period, the 127th became part of William T. Sherman and Ulysses S. Grant's plan to take the all-important city of Vicksburg, Mississippi.
By the beginning of 1863, Vicksburg was one of the final strongholds of the Confederate Army along the Mississippi River. President Lincoln famously remarked, quote, "Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket," end quote. Now, as anyone who's been running late before knows, finding your keys is never as painless a task as you'd hope.
And indeed, the siege of Vicksburg was a hard-fought campaign. But before the siege itself could begin, the surrounding area became a battlefield. In the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, the opening engagement of the Vicksburg campaign, Heywood and his men saw intense combat as skirmishers, soldiers whose presence signaled the start of a battle.
Heywood and the 127th experienced some of the fiercest fighting of the campaign. Over the 7 months of the operation, more than 77,000 in the Union blue would face about 40,000 wearing Confederate gray. Amidst this large-scale fray, Heywood was forced to come to terms with scenes almost unimaginable to us today.
After a trying and bloody conflict outside of a fort called Arkansas Post, the 127th was one of the first to plant the American flag on the Confederate fort. With the skirmish complete, Heywood would have looked back at the field he had fought over. According to one fellow participant in the fight for Arkansas Post, the ground was littered with so many Union dead, quote, "The earth was literally blue from one end of their line to the other."
Anyone who experienced the Civil War had to grapple not only with surviving the slaughter, but with what it meant to them. Civil War historian Drew Gilpin Faust wrote, quote, "Human beings are rarely simply passive victims of death. They are actors, even if they are the dyers. They prepare for death, imagine it, risk it, endure it, seek to understand it. And if they are survivors, they must assume new identities, established by their persistence in face of others' annihilation." End quote.
Corporal Heywood and his men found a new identity in their reliance on each other and their need to simply get through the hardships of the war. During the Vicksburg campaign, Heywood's commanding officer wrote of his men, quote, "The whistling of bullets is as familiar to their ears as household words. Danger they scorn, and the cheerfulness with which they encounter hardships is beyond all praise," end quote. In the maelstrom of battle, the suffering of combat, a steel core must have been forged deep inside of Heywood.
Heywood participated in a few more brutal, dangerous battles during the Long March leading to the capture of Vicksburg. The city surrendered in a massive victory for the Union on July 4th, 1863. Just a few days prior, however, Heywood and 400 members of his regiment were hospitalized on account of grave illness.
The inglorious suffering of disease defined the rest of Heywood's experience in the Civil War. Initially, he was diagnosed with one of the diseases that killed more men in the Civil War than any other: chronic diarrhea. Disease was the unspoken of but ever-present scourge of the Civil War. For every 3 soldiers killed in combat, 5 more died of disease. As he agonized in Memphis's Adams Army Hospital, it seemed likely that Heywood would be killed not by a rebel soldier, but by a disease that would desiccate him until he was dried out.
Heywood suffered through the rest of the year. Despite continuing to carry chronic diarrhea, he was allowed to go home on furlough. Sick as he was unable to return and overstayed his furlough by 17 days. As a result, he was labeled a deserter.
While he spent most of 1863 being transported to hospital after hospital, that label hung over his head. In addition to months of pain, he was still being called a straggler by higher-ups in the Army as the year came to a close.
By March of 1864, it was believed Heywood had miraculously recovered from almost half a year of chronic diarrhea. His misery was not over, however. Within a month, he was hospitalized again in the Cumberland U.S. Army General Hospital. His condition worsened, first being diagnosed with chronic bronchitis, then with anasarca, a body-wide swelling as a result of severe organ damage.
With this horrific diagnosis, Heywood was discharged from the Army, and likely recovering from his illness, he disappeared for 6 months. With a medical discharge after a year of hardship, he could have returned to civilian life.
In December of 1864, Joseph Lee Heywood re-enlisted. He spent the rest of his service at the hospital in Cumberland, this time caring for the sick. As an attendant, Heywood assisted surgeons and helped administer life-saving care to people going through the pain he had so recently escaped. Corporal Heywood was mustered out of service on May 27, 1865, about a month after the war's close.
From the filth of the prisoner of war camp to the slaughter of the battlefield to the immense pain of years spent diseased, Joseph Lee Heywood experienced some of the extremes of the human condition during the Civil War. It must have had a deep, resounding impact on the fabric of his being.
The war ended and normal life resumed. After time spent with his family, Heywood moved to the young state of Minnesota, briefly living in Faribault in 1866. His experience working in the Cumberland Hospital qualified him for work as a druggist, so he worked in a Minneapolis drugstore as well. By 1867, however, just after his 30th birthday, he moved to Northfield.
Not much has been written about a woman named Martha Ann Buffum. She was born August 27, 1838 in Royalston, Massachusetts, only about 10 miles from Joseph's family farm. She was likely still living in Massachusetts during the Civil War. Her nickname was Maddie. She married Joseph Lee Heywood in 1869. Little else has been formally recorded about why, when, or how the relationship between Joseph Lee and Maddie Ann Heywood began.
Maddie gave birth to a daughter on April 25, 1871. Lizzie Mae was her name. Maddie named her daughter after her best friend, a woman named Lizzie Adams. Once again, little has been written about Lizzie Adams, but it's clear that a friendship built on trust and respect blossomed between the two women.
Heywood was building a family while he anchored himself in his new community. At first, he worked as a bookkeeper in S.P. Stewart's lumber mill. In 1872, he accepted a prestigious position as bookkeeper for the First National Bank of Northfield. Shortly after, he became the treasurer of Carleton College. With an infant daughter, a young marriage, and a growing town to call home, perhaps it seemed that the suffering and death of his Civil War years could be supplanted by the promises of a new life.
Mattie Heywood died May 3rd, 1873. We don't know the cause of her death. Why the 34-year-old passed away might be written down somewhere. A letter hidden in an attic, or a port that no one has looked at since, but today her death is obscured by how little we can confidently say about it.
We know of one wish that Mattie had before her death. When she died, she left behind a daughter who had just turned 2, Lizzie May. Mattie wanted Lizzie May to be taken care of. So before she died, she made sure that Joseph knew one thing: that there was one person she could trust to be a mother for Lizzie May. Her best friend, Lizzie Adams. All we can confidently say about Mattie's death, then, is that to her end, her foremost concern was the well-being of her daughter.
Only through other people can we discuss how Heywood was affected by his wife's death. Reverend D.L. Leonard described Heywood as, quote, beyond most men, modest and timid, end quote, as a man who, quote, did not even seem to know that he was lovable and well-beloved and was held in high esteem by all, end quote. It's possible that in the aftermath of his wife's death, Heywood retreated into himself. He was a hard worker and a respected man. But with the tragedy of Mattie's death, there's reason to suspect he carried a profound grief alongside his other sufferings.
Heywood persisted. Acknowledging Mattie's wish, he married Lizzie Adams in 1874. In the next years, he worked as treasurer for the city of Northfield and for the Board of Education. He celebrated his 39th birthday with Lizzie Adams and 5-year-old Lizzie May on August 12, 1876.
That September, Philadelphia hosted the Centennial Exposition, celebrating 100 years of American independence. Northfield's Ames Mill, competing in the flower exhibition, sent several representatives from Northfield. On September 7th, Joseph Lee Heywood was acting cashier to cover one of the resultant absences, alongside an acting bookkeeper named Frank Wilcox and the teller, Alonzo Bunker.
The First National Bank of Northfield held about $15,000, roughly worth $250,000 in today's money. Like all money in local banks of the time, it was uninsured.
A number of regular transactions took place that day. Heywood was finishing up the details for J.S. Allen as the clock struck 2 in the afternoon. As Allen left the bank, 3 men walked in.
Heywood heard their footsteps as they approached the teller.
There was a rustling as they reached into their jackets and unholstered their revolvers.
In a gruff shout tinged with a southern accent, one of them announced a robbery was taking place.
The men jumped over the counter and forced Wilcox and Bunker to their knees with their hands up.
A man with cold eyes turned to Heywood, aimed his revolver, and asked if he was the cashier.
Heywood lied. He said no.
The cold-eyed man asked the same question of Bunker and Wilcox. They told the truth. They said no.
Heywood heard shouting outside the bank. Then, gunfire erupting.
A rough-looking robber lunged towards the bank vault, heading for the safe inside.
Heywood hadn't locked the safe. If the robber tried to open it, all $15,000 would be his for the taking.
Something stirred inside Heywood. Maybe it was something born in him on a bloody field in Mississippi, maybe in a tattered hospital bed, maybe in a small plot in the Northfield graveyard. Something stirred in him.
He threw his body against the door to the bank vault, attempting to lock the robber inside.
The robber heard the door slamming shut and threw his arm out at the last second, prying it open.
His body filled with rage, all of it directed toward Heywood. He grabbed Heywood and pushed him against the wall.
The barrel of his revolver inches from Heywood's brain, he demanded the safe be opened.
Heywood lied. He said it was on a time lock.
Shouts from the outside of the bank grew frenetic as gunfire grew more rapid.
Heywood felt the chaos disrupting the robbers, and he added to it. He shouted, "Murder! Murder!"
The rough-looking robber reeled back his arm and brought the butt of his revolver down on Heywood's temple.
As Heywood crumpled unconscious to the floor, the robber knelt down, grabbed him by the hair, and pulled out a large knife.
The robber brought it across Heywood's neck lightly. He made sure Wilcox and Bunker were watching.
A man outside the bank cursed and demanded the men inside had to get moving.
The robber needed Heywood conscious. He dragged him across the floor and fired a shot into the wall to wake him up.
The shot distracted the other robbers. Bunker ran toward an exit. The robber fired a shot at him, then ran after him and fired another.
One of the robbers, the youngest, left. The robber who chased Bunker grabbed some coins off the counter and left. The man with cold eyes remained.
Heywood was waking up.
He leaned against a table to steady himself.
The man with cold eyes turned to face Heywood.
Heywood met his glare.
The man raised his revolver and fired.
Joseph Lee Heywood died.
The man with cold eyes left.
Heywood's blood crept along the floor, pooling out toward the unlocked bank safe. It reached for the dusty door, beyond which 2 more dead men laid.
The events of September 7th, 1876 spelled the end of the James Younger Gang, a group of ex-Confederates with guerrilla fighting experience who ransacked banks and trains and murdered civilians across the South for a decade after the Civil War.
Joseph Lee Heywood's fight inside the First National Bank gave Northfield citizens enough time to mount a resistance in the street, killing a quarter of the gang's men that day. 1 more would be killed and 3 more captured as Minnesota chased the outlaws down. Only 2 escaped. One was Jesse James, who would be murdered by a fellow outlaw in 1882. The other died in 1915. He never spent a day in jail. He was Frank James, the cold-eyed man who murdered Joseph Lee Heywood in 1876.
Heywood's funeral was held shortly after his murder. The story of his tragic death spread across Minnesota alongside reports of the bank raid, and banks across the state and country pledged funds to support his grieving family.
Lizzie Mae Heywood was 5 when her father was murdered. Less than 6 months after his death, she left with her stepmother to Indianapolis. When young Lizzie left Northfield, she left both her parents, lying next to each other in the cemetery.
For 8 years, Lizzie lived in Massachusetts, until she returned to Northfield to seek education at Carleton, where her father had once worked. After graduation, she lived most of her life far from here, in Pennsylvania, with her husband. She died 70 years after Joseph, in 1947. 1 year later, Northfield held a festival commemorating the events of the day he died. It is a tradition that continues to this day.
How do we sum this up? On September 16th, just over a week after Heywood's death, the Rochester Post briefly discussed the man. He has simply persisted in living, they said, until the time of his tragic death. He simply persisted in living. Through the trauma of the battlefield, he persisted in living. After the agony of disease, he persisted in living. After the crushing loss of his wife, he persisted in living. Northfield remembers and celebrates Heywood today because he died. The real heroism, though, was not how he died. The real heroism of Heywood's fight was the human battle he fought. It's the fight we all face. Through the desolation, the lowest points of our existence, Heywood persisted. We all reach those low points, so Heywood is a hero for us. He persisted in the most human and universal struggle among us, simply living.